The Lumad and State War Machine. Historical context. The Lumad and other indigenous people in Mindanao have been historically and currently facing disadvantages, marginalized by global and local political and economic factors. The state's efforts to eradicate them indicate irretrievable losses.
So, what is a state war machine? So, this is refers to the position of actions taken by governments and state institutions regarding biodiversity, conservation, and the protection of natural resources. It encompasses policies, regulations, and enforcement measures aimed to addressing biodiversity loss and preserving ecosystems. Now we have now the first national imagery and the struggle land for land and resources. The national imagery likely represents the collective perception or narrative of the nation, while the struggle for land and resources highlights the Lumads' fight to retain control over their ancestral territories amidst competing interests from the state and corporations. Next is decoupling Lumad from national imagery. This suggests a call to recognize the Lumad beyond being merely symbols of a bygone era, urging for a more holistic understanding of their temporary political struggles and challenges. The Lumad perspective of decoupling is refers to indigenous peoples in the Philippines who have a deep connection to their ancestral lands and traditional ways of life. Decoupling in this context refers to the process of disconnecting from mainstream narratives and ideologies imposed by internal forces. So the Lumad perspective involves reclaiming an autonomy over their land resources and cultural identity, while challenging dominant discourse that marginalize indigenous voices. Embracing next is the embracing comprehensive and political views. So this entails adopting a holistic and politically aware approach to biodiversity conservation that acknowledges the intersectionality of social, environmental, and economic factors. It involves recognizing indigenous peoples' rights, addressing structural inequalities, and advocating for systematic change to achieve sustainable development and environmental justice. In summary, this subtopic explores the complexities of the state war machine, stance on biodiversity conservation, the role of nation imageries in reshaping conservation efforts, the struggles for land and resources, the Lumad perspective on decoupling from dominant narratives, and the importance of embracing comprehensive and politically informed views in conservation efforts.
The Lumad and land ownership. Well, their experience has in fact a lot to teach us in terms of how we could imagine an alternative national order. One of the long lasting and structural consequences of the colonization was the imposition of the private property relations to the local economy. From a regard for the land was a trusteeship or stewardship according to Gaspard in the year 2000. This was supplanted with individual ownership rights during the colonization and became the base of landlordship relations. One cannot underestimate the importance of such imposition, for it would have ramification to the development of the local economy even after the period of colonialism. By rewarding ownership rights to the cabezas or the go-betweens, The Spaniards were able to modify the disposition of the local leaders who once acted as the custodians of their community's interest to that which prioritized their own private interest and their colonial masters. This trait would endure even after the departure of the Spaniards, tolerated and even strengthened by the Americans, and essentially defined the dynamics between and among the members of the modern Principalia and the Filipino masses in the post-war era up to the present. There is moreover this there is a contrary view presented by a number of scholars who assert that our indigenous people have private property concept concepts on the land and therefore challenge the myth of communal land tenure, according to Gutmaitan in the year 2005, in Aguilar and Ason. It is their assertion that the monobos, for instance, hold private land ownership concepts that may be contrary to the implied assumption of the 1997 Indigenous People Rights Act. So, one of the arguments cites the prevalence of dato or community chieftains who are allowed to own more land than the rest of the community. That was also stated by Gatmaitan in the year 2005. So, Gaspar, however, cites various studies comparing Manobo and Kalinga land laws where the communal nature of land ownership is shared as a possible riposte to such assertion by Gatmaitan and Moore or et al. Gaspar cites the study of Martinez in the year 1989. Among the Hanonos of Mindoro, wherein culture contact between indigenous and lowland culture have led to the articulation of the semi-feudal, semi-capitalist mode of production and the incursion of the private land ownership practices, as what stated by Gaspar in the year 2000. So in this study, among the Banwaon of Agosan del Sur shows the resistance to adopt private ownership of land, a cause of their bitter struggle with their dato who wants to appropriate it for himself and his family's gain. Whether the communal land ownership was a myth and never took place remains a contestable position. But the damage of the what O.D. Corpus in the year 1997 called the landlordship double economy imposed by colonialism, in hindsight, has been endured and depth and has clearly played a role in the historical marginalization of the Lumad. Moreover, a judicious study of Lumad culture is now pointing us to alternatives. The struggle of the Lumad versus the attempt of the state and the private interest to assimilate their way of life can point us to recover what is on the verge of extinction, or at least imagine an alternative that has always been there, ready for us to give birth to.
In this juncture, we are going to talk about the Beyond Industria. But before we dive into our discussion, let us define first what is Beyond Industria. So, when we say Beyond Industria, it is somewhat part of industrial policy that is a type of intervention or government policy that attempts to improve the business environment or to alter the structure of economic activity towards sectors. In a broad sense, industrial policy refers to a state intervention aiming at improving the prospects for industrial competitiveness and economic growth. This might also be considered as the backbone of the future economy, since with this policy it supports the present to preserve the previous practices and beliefs that was developed long ago and was passed down through generations. So currently, as what we have observed, because of the constant evolution of the society and the advanced modernization, some particular group are being affected. There are also tendency among many to look at the situation of the Lumad in Mindanao and indigenous peoples in general through rose-colored lenses. There are those afflicted by hidden romanticism in understanding indigenous people's plight, and therefore that is why they are seen as noble savages that deserves to remain untouched and uncontaminated by the vagaries of this modern life. These IPs in Mindanao are culturally and collectively referred to as Lumad, which is a local Cebuano term that means born of the earth or indigenous. This name inappropriately describes these vulnerable groups. They are the original inhabitants of the island and they existed before colonial times. They are largely animistic ethnic minorities who retain their way of beliefs and traditions. Many Lumads are being discriminated and suffers displacement in the society. Some of which also it includes their unfair caught between the conflict of the government and the armed communist group. Another also is in the land grabbing or extraction, which impacted the lands and the lives of the indigenous peoples, which Lumads are pushed to evacuate their territories and live temporarily in evacuation shelters in dire conditions. Since they are not used to the lifestyle in big cities, their overall welfare is affected. Because of this, it enables them to transfer to isolated areas around Mindanao, especially in the mountainous areas. That is why there are many who argue that left discourse is equally dangerous to indigenous peoples and their culture, wherein in left discourse it involved the complexity where it would involve defatalizing social processes and understanding them as possibilities open to discussion, a scheme that could be used to understand the new distribution of roles. The right would be inclined to underscore the inevitable nature of social processes, and the left would tend to assert their moldable dimension. The right would prefer simplification, modernization, and nothing more, while the left would be inclined toward the complexity or a reflective modernization, wherein when the time comes for the change and progression, the notion of progress just do not work anymore if what is meant by it is a future that is less complex, because what awaits us would be a radically more complex future development.
So now let's proceed to the new formulation. So in October 2016, 3,000 delegates from indigenous groups across Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao convened for Lakbayan 2016. This gathering marked a pivotal moment in the struggle for indigenous in the Philippines. New formulations and alliance was building October 12, 2014, and it was convened for form of alliances and focusing on the national minority groups, including the Lumad. This gathering aimed to address issues such as extrajudicial killings and the enrichment of big businesses on the ancestral lands. And also it shows about the rise of the Lumad. The Lumad or Mindanao's indigenous peoples have risen to national consciousness. Previous events like Manilak Bayan showcased their determination to address extrajudicial killings, land enrichment, and militarization. So the rise of LUMAD and collaborative efforts was done on October 12 to 28, 2016, and there was a continuation to efforts to unite Moro and non-Moro indigenous people against common oppressions, emphasizing the challenges of limited access to social services, militarization, and enrichment of foreign interest on ancestral lands. So the activities, there are activities of Lakbayan 2016, no? The Lakbayan delegates engaged in various activities aimed at raising awareness and advocating for indigenous rights. These activities range from the cultural showcases to discussions on pressing issues. Also, the unity of indigenous groups. Lakbayan 2016 witnessed unity among Moro and other indigenous group nationwide, dubbed as the Log Pambansang Minorya para sa sariling pagpapasya. They collectively address systemic oppression faced by minority communities. So also it has a common struggles and challenges, and indigenous groups across Philippines share common struggles including limited access to social services and enrichment of foreign interest on ancestral lands. So, Lakbayan 2016 shed light on these challenges, and it has a call to action, which is the Lumad, Moro, and other indigenous groups have united to demand self-determination and recognition of their rights. It's time for the Filipino public and government to heed their call and stand in solidarity. And to formally end, Lakbayan 2016 symbolizes the collective strength and resilience of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Let us amplify their voices and support their ongoing struggle for justice and autonomy.
The Lumad, Moro, Aitas, Igorots, Mangyans, Ati, and Tumandogs have formed the Sandugo Alliance to combat appropriation and plunder of ancestral lands by foreign interests. This new unity among national minority groups in the Philippines is a significant shift from focusing on uniqueness to commonalities. Purpose of the alliance is to combat appropriation and plunder of ancestral lands by foreign interest with Philippines state complicity. The alliance aims to highlight the shared marginalized foreign interest often with the support of the Philippine state complicity. The significance of this alliance is that, first, it clarifies the relationship between minority groups and elite-led state. Second, emphasizes commonalities over specificities in their historical marginalization. And lastly, it models resistance against imperialism. Lessons from minority groups. Value of unity in combating oppression. Importance of self-determination. Resilience in the face of adversity. Our national minorities have imparted valuable lessons to us by bravely resisting imperialism. Their experiences have given us valuable knowledge as they pursue self determination.